The knife in my hand trembled, not because I was cutting through the roast, but because of the words that had just spilled from my uncle's mouth like poison dropped into wine. "You're not part of this family's future," Richard said, his booming laugh echoing across the table while the other relatives froze mid-bite, their faces caught between horror and a strange, complicit amusement. The golden lights of the Christmas tree flickered in the corner, casting a mockery of warmth across the room, while my cheeks burned as though I'd been branded in front of them all. I looked around, searching for my mother's eyes, but she kept them lowered, trembling fingers fussing with her napkin. My heart pounded in my chest, and though the roast's scent filled the air, all I could taste was the bitterness of humiliation, sharp and suffocating. I could feel the silence that followed his words settling like heavy snow across the table, smothering whatever joy this night was supposed to hold. My cousin Sophia, dressed in red silk that shimmered under the chandelier, pressed her lips together, trying and failing to hide the curl of a smirk. My grandmother Eleanor, always so composed, lifted her wine glass with trembling fingers, though she said nothing, her silence speaking louder than words. And Richard, towering even while seated at the head of the table, leaned back in his chair, satisfied with the spectacle he'd created, savoring his cruelty as though it were part of the feast. I wanted to scream, to rise and strike his words back at him, but my legs felt nailed to the ground, my body betraying the storm raging inside me. As a child, I had endured years of subtle slights. "Isabella doesn't have the same ambition. Isabella isn't as gifted as Sophia," always whispered under the guise of family banter. But this was no whisper. This was a declaration, loud and sharp, meant to cut me in front of everyone I had ever struggled to prove myself to. I clenched my fist beneath the table, feeling the nails dig into my palms until the sting steadied me. My mother, Maria, stole a glance at me, her face pale, her lips parted as though she wanted to defend me but had forgotten how. She looked so small compared to her older brother, the tyrant who had always controlled the air in this house, and it was in that moment I realized she had lived her whole life under his shadow. The candles flickered, bending in the draft of tension that swept the room. I could hear my own breathing over the soft clinks of cutlery from those who pretended nothing had been said, eager to return to comfort rather than confront the cruelty. My chest ached with a mixture of shame and fury. I wasn't a child anymore, and I wouldn't be dismissed like one. For years, I had swallowed my place at the edge of this family, convinced I didn't belong, but that night, something inside me cracked open. Richard thought he had won with his laughter, but he didn't know that beneath my silence lay a secret far heavier than his arrogance could withstand. As he raised his glass and toasted to the future, his words dripping with mockery, I saw the faces of everyone at the table. Sophia glowing with smugness, my mother's eyes glistening with suppressed tears, Eleanor's silence curdling into something more sorrowful than complicit, and the others, distant cousins, business partners, those who orbited Richard's power, avoiding my gaze as though I were already erased from their history. My body shook, but it wasn't from weakness. It was from the weight of the truth I had carried for too long, a truth that could tear through the foundation of Richard's empire like fire in dry wood. I swallowed hard, pressing the napkin against my knees to ground myself. The taste of metal lingered on my tongue, born not from blood, but from rage so sharp it felt tangible. My mind flickered to the nights I had sat alone, piecing together fragments of whispers, letters, and memories that no one had ever wanted me to discover. I had always thought Christmas was meant to bring families closer, but here it revealed the cracks, the cruel laughter, the cowardly silence, the love that never was. And in that moment, I made a decision that pulsed through my veins like fire. This dinner would not end as Richard intended. This would not be another night where I swallowed his dominance. He thought he had stripped me of power, but what he didn't know was that I held the one truth that could silence him forever. I lay awake long after the dinner ended, the echo of Richard's laughter still ricocheting through my mind, like a cruel melody that refused to die down. The guests had dispersed, some offering half-hearted embraces at the door, their eyes refusing to meet mine. My mother's silence followed me upstairs, heavier than any insult Richard had hurled. She hadn't said a word in my defense, not one. I had wanted to scream at her, to demand why she let her brother humiliate me. But when I saw her trembling hands folding the tablecloth with robotic precision, I understood. She was too broken to fight him. It enraged me more, because her fear had become the foundation of his power. In the solitude of my bedroom, surrounded by childhood photographs that looked foreign to me now, I felt both shame and rage twisting together into something unrecognizable. How many years had I lived in this house, knowing my place was fragile, my belonging conditional? My mind wandered back to when I was 10, listening to Richard's booming voice tell me I wasn't sharp enough to inherit the business. Not brilliant like Sophia. Those words had cut deep then, but I had buried them. Tonight, however, they rose like old scars reopening, and I finally asked myself, why had I been chosen as the target of his cruelty? Why did he fight so hard to erase me? The answer was locked in the secret I had carried for years. Richard had underestimated me, always seeing me as a fragile branch on the family tree, ready to snap. But I had seen things he didn't know I saw. I had followed trails he thought he had erased. I had pieced together fragments of a truth that, if spoken aloud, would make his empire of arrogance collapse in seconds. Still, the thought of exposing it terrified me. I wasn't sure if I had the strength to bring it all into the light, not because I feared his wrath, but because the secret would destroy more than just him. It would shake the very roots of our family. My mother knocked on my door softly that night, her voice timid as though she feared I would turn her away. "Isabella," she whispered, "try to forget what he said. He didn't mean it." The words tasted like betrayal. Didn't mean it? He had meant every syllable, and she knew it. When I didn't respond, she opened the door and stepped inside, her face pale in the dim light. She looked at me with pleading eyes, the kind that begged for understanding but offered no protection. For a moment, I wanted to tell her everything, to spill the truth I had uncovered, but I bit my tongue. She wasn't ready, and perhaps neither was I. I turned to her, my voice low but steady. "Why do you let him do this to us?" I asked, the question slipping out before I could soften it. Her eyes welled with tears, her lips trembling as she pressed her hands to her chest. "Because sometimes it's safer to stay quiet," she whispered. Her words broke me. Safety at the cost of dignity, silence at the cost of truth. That was the curse my mother had lived under. But I wasn't her. I had inherited her gentleness, yes, but also a fire that she had long extinguished in herself. And in that moment, I swore to myself I would not stay quiet. The night stretched on, and as the clock struck midnight, I pulled out the hidden folder from beneath my bed. Inside were letters, photographs, and a single signed document that tied Richard to something far darker than cruelty. It tied him to betrayal. My hands shook as I stared at the evidence, the secret I had sworn to keep until the right moment. Tonight had proven that the right moment was near. Richard had mocked me, erased me, laughed at me, but he had no idea how close he was to losing everything he held dear. And when the time came, I would not falter. His laughter would be replaced by silence. The following morning, the house felt suffocatingly quiet, as though the walls themselves were ashamed of what had unfolded at the table. My mother moved like a shadow through the kitchen, preparing coffee with her back turned to me, her silence louder than any scolding could have been. Richard, of course, had already left. He never lingered after a spectacle, always certain that his words would echo long enough without his presence. I sat by the window, staring out at the snow-covered garden, trying to make sense of the storm brewing in my chest. His cruelty had crossed a line, and my silence could no longer be part of his game. Richard wasn't just my uncle. He was the patriarch of our fractured dynasty, the man who held the reins of the family's wealth and business. My grandfather's empire, once built with sweat and sacrifice, had been handed into Richard's greedy hands after a series of carefully orchestrated moves. He had positioned himself as indispensable, the one who carried everyone's future, when in truth, he carried only his own ambition. I had heard whispers for years, shady contracts, money that disappeared, deals that hurt those loyal to him, but these whispers had been dismissed, drowned beneath his charisma and authority. To the family, he was untouchable. To me, he was human, and dangerously flawed. As a child, I had been fascinated by him. He was the man with the booming laugh, the stories that made everyone lean closer, the one who seemed larger than life. But even then, I noticed the cracks. I remembered once, at 12 years old, sneaking into his office after a party. I found him hunched over his desk, his face buried in his hands, muttering names I didn't recognize. Papers lay scattered, numbers and signatures that didn't match, and a single glass of whiskey half empty beside him. I slipped away before he noticed, but the image never left me. Richard, alone and desperate, his mask slipping when no one was watching. That image returned to me now, sharper than ever, as I pulled out the folder from beneath my bed once more. Inside was the proof of the secret I had carried for so long. The photographs showed him meeting with a man whose name, if spoken, would rot his reputation overnight, a competitor he had sworn to destroy. The letters revealed transactions hidden from the family's eyes, money funneled into accounts no one else knew existed, and the document, the most damning of all, was signed in his unmistakable hand, a contract that betrayed the very foundation of the business our grandfather had built. Richard hadn't been protecting the family's future. He had been selling it, the weight of what I knew pressed against me like an iron chain. If I revealed the truth, I would shatter the illusion he had built, strip him of his power, and reclaim the dignity he had stolen from me and my mother. But it would also mean turning the family against itself, ripping apart bonds that, fragile as they were, still held us together. My stomach twisted as I imagined the looks on their faces, the betrayal in their eyes. Would they believe me, or would they call me a liar, poisoned by resentment? Richard had spent years crafting the narrative that I was weak, unreliable, disposable. The truth might not be enough if they still clung to his lies. Yet as I stared at the evidence, I knew one thing with certainty. Richard's empire was not built on strength. It was built on silence. My mother's silence, my grandmother's silence, the family's silence. If I chose to speak, I would be the crack that split the foundation wide open. And perhaps that was my purpose all along, not to be part of Richard's future, but to rewrite it entirely. The thought both terrified and exhilarated me. My hands trembled as I closed the folder, whispering to myself in the stillness of my room, "He won't laugh again. Not after I'm done." The day after Christmas, I visited my grandmother Eleanor. Unlike my mother, she never avoided uncomfortable truths. She simply buried them in layers of cryptic remarks and lingering stares that made you wonder if she saw straight through you. Her house smelled of cedar and old books, a place where silence wasn't oppressive but heavy with memory. As I entered her living room, she looked up from her armchair, her eyes sharper than her frail body suggested. "Richard went too far this time," she said before I even opened my mouth. My breath caught. She had heard, perhaps even anticipated it. With Eleanor, nothing was ever hidden for long. I sat beside her, my hands clenched, unsure how much to reveal. There was a dangerous comfort in her presence, as though confessing to her would release me from the weight I carried. She watched me, unblinking, her thin fingers wrapped around a teacup that trembled slightly in her grasp. "You're not asking the right question, Isabella," she whispered. "It isn't about why Richard mocked you. It's about why he fears you." Those words struck me like a blow. Fear? I had spent my life thinking Richard saw me as weak, insignificant. Could it be that, deep down, he knew I was the only one who could unmask him? Her statement opened a floodgate inside me, and before I could stop myself, I pulled out one of the letters I had brought in my coat pocket. Eleanor leaned forward, her eyes narrowing as she scanned the paper. She didn't seem surprised, not even shocked. Instead, she sighed deeply, the sound of someone who had been expecting this moment for years. "So, you've found it," she murmured. My pulse quickened. "You knew?" I asked, almost accusingly. Her silence was my answer. She had known Richard's betrayal, had chosen to live with it, to protect the family name rather than expose the truth. "Why didn't you say anything?" I demanded, my voice cracking, the anger bubbling up from years of feeling abandoned. Eleanor's lips trembled into a sad smile, because sometimes the family would rather live under a lie than face destruction. Richard is not just a man to them. He is the illusion of stability. Without him, everything crumbles, and I was too old to be the one to hold the pieces together. Her honesty cut deeper than denial ever could. It meant she had made the same choice my mother had, silence over chaos. But unlike my mother, Eleanor looked at me as though she knew I wouldn't make the same mistake. I stared at her, my heart torn between admiration and fury. She had allowed Richard to rise unchecked, his power metastasizing over decades, poisoning everyone in its reach. And now, the burden of truth had fallen on me. "If I speak, it will destroy him," I whispered, almost as if testing the words aloud. Eleanor placed her hand over mine, her grip surprisingly strong. "Sometimes destruction is the only path to renewal," she said. "But be careful, Isabella. A wounded animal is most dangerous when it senses its end. If you strike, you must strike fully. Half-truths will only make him stronger." As I left her house that evening, the cold air bit into my skin, but it only sharpened my resolve. My grandmother's words echoed in my mind. each syllable a warning and a command. Richard didn't just despise me, he feared me, and that fear would be the weapon I needed. Yet I also knew Eleanor was right. There was no safe way to do this, no clean unraveling of lies. If I chose to expose him, I would ignite a fire that could burn us all. And as the snow crunched beneath my boots, I promised myself one thing. When the moment came, I would not hold back. Richard returned to the house 2 days later, as if nothing had happened on Christmas night. He carried his usual air of confidence, his laughter filling the rooms like smoke, intoxicating and suffocating all at once. He shook hands with uncles, kissed the cheeks of aunts, and ruffled the hair of cousins who still idolized him. Watching him was like watching a magician perform tricks I already knew the secrets to. I could see the strings, the sleight of hand, the hidden cards tucked up his sleeve. He was still adored, still untouchable in their eyes, and that made my blood boil. How could they not see? At dinner that evening, the tension in me became unbearable. Richard launched into a story about how he had saved one of the family businesses from collapse, his voice booming with self-praise. I caught my mother's eyes across the table, silently begging her to challenge him, but she lowered her gaze and stirred her soup. That was her choice every time. Survival through silence. My hands clenched into fists beneath the tablecloth. His words weren't just lies. They were rehearsed performances, carefully crafted to reinforce the illusion that he alone kept us afloat. I couldn't sit still. I couldn't let it go unanswered. "Funny," I said suddenly, my voice slicing through the chatter like a blade, "because from what I've seen, that business wasn't saved. It was sold." The table went silent, forks suspended, eyes turning toward me in shock. Richard froze for only a fraction of a second, but I saw it, that flicker of panic before he plastered his charming grin back into place. "Ah, Isabella," he chuckled, "always so dramatic. You shouldn't listen to rumors. They poison your mind." His attempt to dismiss me sent a surge of heat to my chest. He wasn't laughing at me anymore. He was defending himself. I leaned forward, my pulse pounding, determined not to back down. Not rumors, documents, signatures, numbers that don't lie. A hush spread through the room, relatives shifting uncomfortably in their chairs, unsure if this was a joke or the beginning of something much darker. My mother's face went pale, and she whispered my name as though begging me to stop. Richard, however, tilted his head and smiled, but this time his smile didn't reach his eyes. "You've always had a vivid imagination," he said softly, his words edged with steel. "Be careful, Isabella. Some stories can ruin a family." His threat hung in the air like smoke, choking the room with unspoken fear. My cousins avoided my gaze, some embarrassed, others curious. I wanted to scream, to pull out the folder right there and scatter the evidence across the tablecloth, but I stopped myself. Eleanor's warning rang in my ears. "If you strike, strike fully." Tonight had only been a test, a small crack in Richard's mask, and I had seen what I needed to see. He wasn't invincible. He could bleed, and I had made him bleed in front of them. It was only a matter of time before the wound widened. Later, as I retreated to my room, my mother followed, her face taut with fear. "What are you doing?" she hissed, her hands trembling as she shut the door behind us. I stared at her, my frustration boiling over. "I'm telling the truth. Isn't that what we're supposed to do?" She shook her head violently, tears brimming in her eyes. "The truth won't save us, Isabella. It will destroy everything." Her words stung, because I knew she wasn't lying. She was terrified, but as I lay in bed that night, staring at the ceiling, I also knew something she didn't. Sometimes destruction is the only path to freedom, and I was ready to burn it all. The morning after that dinner confrontation, the house felt colder, as though Richard's shadow had seeped into the walls and poisoned the air. Everyone acted normal. My aunts baked, my cousins played, and the men spoke loudly about work and politics. But underneath, I sensed the shift. Richard had been wounded, and now the entire family was waiting to see how he would respond. I kept silent, keeping my eyes on him whenever we crossed paths, noting every twitch in his jaw, every forced smile. He was pretending to be unbothered, but I could feel it. He was watching me now, studying me like a predator studies prey. I knew I couldn't stand alone in this. Eleanor's words echoed in my mind. A wounded animal is most dangerous at the end. If I was going to expose him, I would need allies, people who could stand beside me when the storm hit. I started quietly. My cousin Daniel, a year older than me, had always seemed skeptical of Richard's supposed perfection. That afternoon, while he smoked on the back porch, I joined him, pulling my coat tight around me against the chill. For a while, we said nothing. Then, in a low voice, I asked, "Do you ever wonder why Richard always needs to remind everyone how much he's done for this family?" Daniel exhaled smoke and smiled bitterly. "All the time." I pressed further, carefully, afraid to reveal too much too soon. "What if it's because the truth is very different?" He flicked his cigarette into the snow and turned to me with a strange look in his eyes. "I've thought about that, but saying it aloud is dangerous." That was all I needed to hear. Daniel wasn't blind. He had seen the cracks too. I pulled out a folded page from my pocket and showed him one of the letters I had discovered. His eyes widened, his jaw tightening as he scanned the words. "So it's true," he whispered. His voice carried both relief and dread. "You have proof." That small moment of validation gave me a strength I hadn't realized I needed. I wasn't insane. I wasn't imagining things. Someone else could see it too. Daniel leaned in closer, lowering his voice even more. "If Richard finds out you have this, he won't forgive you. He'll destroy you." His warning didn't scare me. It fueled me. "That's why I need help," I said firmly. "I can't be the only voice. If others know the truth, he can't silence us all." Daniel studied me for a long moment before nodding slowly. "Then we need to be smart. If we're going to do this, we need to gather everything, not just scraps." Later that evening, I sat with Eleanor again. She looked tired, her eyes heavier than before, but when I told her Daniel had seen the letters, she gave me the faintest smile. "Good," she whispered. "Truth multiplies when shared. But be careful. Richard has ears everywhere. He won't let this pass." I asked her directly why she had never told anyone else, why she had carried this secret alone for so long. Her eyes watered, and for the first time, I saw regret in her expression. "Because I thought silence would protect you. I thought the lie was safer than the war." That broke something inside me. Protect me? By letting him rule us all. The next day, Richard approached me alone in the hallway. His eyes were sharp, his smile gone. "You embarrassed me in front of everyone," he said coldly, his voice low but dangerous. "That was your one mistake. Don't make another." His presence was suffocating, his words dripping with menace. I met his stare and forced myself not to look away. "Or what?" I whispered. He didn't answer. Instead, he leaned in so close I could feel his breath. "You'll regret it." Then he walked away, leaving me trembling but also strangely certain. Richard knew I had something, and fear was starting to eat at him. That evening, I went to Daniel's room, documents tucked under my arm. We sat cross-legged on the floor, sifting through the evidence piece by piece. Financial records, hidden contracts, letters signed in his name. Each page built a puzzle of deceit that Richard had hidden for over a decade. Daniel muttered curses under his breath as the pile grew, his disbelief shifting into fury. "He's been stealing from everyone. Even Grandma's inheritance was siphoned." My stomach turned as I realized just how deep the betrayal went. This wasn't just about reputation or pride. It was theft, manipulation, a betrayal of trust so profound it left me shaking. But while Daniel focused on the money, my mind lingered on something darker. Among the papers, there were fragments of letters Richard had written, desperate and pleading, but not to banks or businesses. These were written to someone else, someone outside the family. The language was cryptic, almost panicked, like a man begging for mercy. Who was he writing to? And why did it feel like the answer was even bigger than money? I tucked those particular pages aside, knowing instinctively they were the key to unraveling the secret he had guarded so viciously. By midnight, Daniel and I had a plan. Gather everything, build a full picture, then confront Richard publicly so no one could deny it. But as I lay awake later, staring at the ceiling, unease gnawed at me. Richard wasn't just corrupt. There was something else, something hidden beneath the surface that even Eleanor had been too afraid to say aloud. And when I closed my eyes, I heard his threat again, whispering through the silence, "You'll regret it." What if he was right? What if the truth I was about to reveal wasn't just destructive, but catastrophic? The next 2 days unfolded like a storm building over calm waters, silent, yet charged with a force that could tear everything apart. Richard's behavior shifted in ways only those of us watching closely could notice. He laughed louder at the dinner table, poured wine more generously, and even toasted to family unity. But beneath his performance, I saw the tightening of his eyes and the restless movement of his hands. He was overcompensating, desperate to control the narrative, to mask the fear seeping through his carefully constructed facade. And while everyone else clapped their glasses together and smiled, I sat frozen, knowing his mask was slipping. Daniel and I continued working in secret, meeting late at night in corners of the house where no one wandered. We spread the documents across his bed and pieced together the timeline of Richard's deceit. Every page felt like a dagger plunged into my chest. Bank accounts overseas, false reports he had fed to the family about investments, and evidence that he had diverted money that should have gone to repairs, scholarships, and even charity projects our grandmother once cherished. The numbers weren't just figures on a sheet. They were stories of lives altered, dreams crushed, trust obliterated. Daniel's anger grew by the hour, but mine turned into a cold determination. Yet the letters still haunted me. They weren't financial, not in the usual sense. They were emotional, trembling with desperation. "I can't keep covering this," one line read. Another, "If they find out, I'm ruined." The handwriting matched Richard's perfectly, but who were they addressed to? No names, just initials scrawled at the top of each page. JM, over and over. It was as though Richard had poured his terror into these confessions, pleading with some unseen figure to shield him. The more I read them, the more I realized the money was only the surface of the story. Something deeper was rotting beneath. It wasn't long before Richard began to retaliate, subtly but unmistakably. First it was whispers. Cousins I had grown up with started pulling away, casting suspicious glances when I walked into a room. My Aunt Gloria suddenly avoided me, muttering that young people should mind their place. Even my mother, though she never said it outright, seemed uneasy around me, her smiles more brittle than usual. Richard was poisoning them slowly, making me out to be the troublemaker, the ungrateful child trying to tear down the family. It was brilliant in its cruelty, because it left me isolated without ever raising his voice. But isolation only fueled my fire. If he thought he could silence me by cutting me off, he didn't know me at all. Daniel remained steadfast, though I could see the toll it was taking on him too. "We can't fight him alone forever," he whispered one night, exhaustion heavy in his voice. "If the others keep turning against us, we'll look like conspirators, not truth-tellers." He wasn't wrong, and the thought chilled me. Richard didn't need to destroy the evidence. He just needed to destroy our credibility. And in this family, perception had always mattered more than truth. I decided to seek out Eleanor again. She looked weaker each time I visited, her body fragile like paper, but her eyes still held the same fire. When I told her about the letters signed to JM, her hands trembled as she gripped mine. "You found those?" she whispered. I nodded, desperate for answers. Her eyes darted toward the door before she leaned closer. "You're not ready for what those mean. Promise me you'll be careful, Isabella. This secret, it's not just about money. It could destroy more than Richard." My heart pounded as I begged her to explain, but she only shook her head. Not yet. That night, unable to sleep, I returned to the study where I had first found the letters. Every creak of the floorboards made my pulse quicken. Every shadow seemed to hold Richard's gaze. I pulled out the box again, going through every paper one by one. At the very bottom, hidden beneath receipts and old notes, I found another envelope marked with the same initials, JM, but this one was unopened. My fingers trembled as I slid it out. Unlike the others, it was heavier, sealed tightly with wax. Something in my gut told me this was what Eleanor had feared, the thing even Richard hadn't dared confront. I wanted to open it immediately, but hesitation rooted me to the spot. If I broke the seal, there would be no going back. My mind raced with possibilities. Was JM a lover, an accomplice, or worse, someone within the family who knew everything? The temptation gnawed at me, but before I could decide, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Panic surged through me. I shoved the envelope under my sweater, just as the door creaked open. Richard stood there in the dim light, his silhouette filling the frame, his eyes fixed on me, and for the first time, his mask completely dropped. "You shouldn't be here," he said flatly, his voice colder than I had ever heard it. I could feel the envelope pressed against my skin, my heartbeat thundering in my ears. For a long moment, neither of us moved. Then he stepped forward, closing the door behind him with deliberate slowness. His smile was gone, replaced by something rawer, darker. "Tell me, Isabella, what exactly have you found?" My throat tightened, but I forced myself to hold his gaze. In that instant, I realized the war between us had begun in earnest, and there would be no hiding anymore. Richard's stare bore into me like a blade, pinning me against the silence of the study. My hands shook beneath my sweater where the envelope was hidden, its edges pressing into my ribs as though demanding to be opened. For a moment I couldn't breathe. The room seemed smaller, suffocating. As he stepped closer, his voice low and almost serpentine. "Curiosity will get you killed in this family," he whispered. I wanted to scream, to run, but my body betrayed me, frozen in the gravity of his presence. Yet somewhere inside me, courage flickered. I couldn't let him see my fear. "I'm not a child anymore, Richard," I managed, my voice steadier than I felt. "You don't get to decide what I know." His jaw tightened, and for a second, I thought he might strike me. But instead, he smiled, a smile so cold it chilled my bones. "Then I suppose you'll learn the hard way," he muttered before brushing past me and exiting the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. I stood in the heavy quiet, clutching the envelope as if it were a lifeline. His retreat only confirmed what I already suspected. Whatever was inside it was powerful enough to terrify him. I fled to my room, locking the door behind me, my pulse racing like a drum. I turned the envelope over and over in my hands, the wax seal glinting faintly in the lamplight. The initials JM seemed to taunt me, daring me to unravel the secret. With trembling fingers, I broke the seal, the sound of wax cracking loud in the silence. The paper inside was thick, almost brittle, as though it had been hidden for years. When I unfolded it, I expected financial figures, confessions, maybe even blackmail. But the first words made my blood run cold. "To my son, James." My son? James? My mind raced. I didn't know a James in our family, not in the immediate circle, not even among the extended relatives we barely spoke to. I read on, each line twisting the world around me. The letter was written by my grandfather, years before his death. He spoke of shame, of betrayal, of a child conceived outside of marriage with a woman no one in the family ever knew. That child's name was James, born in secrecy, hidden away to preserve the family's reputation. And the most shocking revelation came at the end. "Richard, you must care for him as your own, for he is your brother, though none must ever know." The air left my lungs in a gasp. James, the initials JM. They weren't a stranger at all. They were family, hidden family, which meant Richard had carried this secret for over a decade, maybe longer, guarding it with lies and deception. But why the money? Why the fear? My eyes darted back to the envelope. At the very bottom of the page, almost as an afterthought, my grandfather had added a line. "There are funds set aside for James's care, but never let Isabella know. She must be kept away from this truth." And my hands trembled so violently I nearly dropped the letter. My name was written there, etched into the heart of the secret. The weight of it crushed me. My grandfather had deliberately excluded me, had bound Richard with a command to erase me from this hidden legacy. Was this why Richard resented me so deeply? Was his cruelty at dinner, his laugh at my expense, all rooted in this twisted burden he'd been carrying? A part of me wanted to weep, to crumple into the floor and drown in the betrayal. But another part of me, stronger, sharper, lit with fury. If Richard thought he could bury me under his lies, he was about to learn how wrong he was. The next day, I met Daniel by the old chapel behind the house, far from prying ears. I showed him the letter, my voice breaking as I explained what I had found. His face drained of color. "So, there's another heir," he whispered. "Another piece of this family no one has ever acknowledged." He looked at me with wide, almost fearful eyes. "Isabella, if this comes out, it won't just shame Richard. It could rip the entire family apart. Everything they've built, their reputation, their legacy. It would all come crashing down." I nodded, the paper trembling in my hands. "Good," I said. "It's time the truth did exactly that." But Daniel wasn't so easily convinced. "Think carefully," he warned, his tone sharp. "If you reveal this at the wrong moment, they'll call you a liar. Richard will twist it, turn it back on you. You need to choose your moment, and when you do, it has to be undeniable." His words sank into me like stone. He was right. If I wanted to break Richard, I had to strike when he least expected it, when the whole family was watching, when silence would be the only response. And there was only one event big enough, public enough, to hold that kind of power. Christmas dinner. As the day approached, the tension in the house grew unbearable. Richard prowled the halls like a lion guarding its territory, his eyes following me everywhere I went. He knew I had the letter, though he hadn't dared confront me again. The rest of the family, blissfully ignorant, busied themselves with preparations, decorating the grand hall, polishing silverware, wrapping gifts. Laughter and music filled the air, but beneath it all, I felt the storm rising, ready to split everything open. Christmas, once a day of warmth and unity, was about to become the battlefield where I would change our family forever. The dining room glowed with golden light, chandeliers scattering warmth across the table set with fine china, crystal glasses, and dishes steaming with the scents of rosemary, roasted meats, and cinnamon-laced desserts. To anyone passing by, it would have looked like a perfect Christmas dinner, a portrait of wealth and harmony. But for me, every flicker of a candle was another reminder that the family was blind to the storm swelling in its heart. I sat near the end of the table, my pulse racing beneath my skin, the letter folded tightly in my lap. Around me, laughter bubbled, conversations overlapped, and wine flowed freely. Yet all I heard was the steady, poisonous hum of Richard's presence across from me. He leaned back in his chair, his voice booming, his laughter filling the room like smoke choking the air. He was too comfortable, too confident. Tonight, that was going to change. Dinner began with my grandmother, Eleanor, offering her usual blessing, her voice soft, aged, yet dignified as she asked for gratitude, unity, and peace among us. It almost broke me, hearing her pray for togetherness while I held the weapon that could destroy it all. As everyone lifted forks and clinked glasses, I noticed how easily they slipped into roles, cousins bragging about careers, aunts fussing over the turkey, uncles debating politics. And then, like a stone thrown into still water, Richard's laughter cut through it all. He raised his glass, eyes scanning the table, until they landed on me. "And let us not forget dear Isabella," he said loudly, his words dripping with sarcasm. "Always here, always, watching. But let's be honest, she's not exactly part of this family's future, is she?" The words struck me like a physical blow. Forks froze mid-air. For a moment, silence hovered, heavy and awkward. A few cousins chuckled nervously, unsure if it was a joke. My mother's eyes darted to me, filled with warning, pleading silently for me to ignore him. But I felt the rage rise, hot and unstoppable, a tide that had been building for years. Richard smirked, proud of the discomfort he'd caused, confident that I would shrink away as I had so many times before, but I didn't. Slowly, deliberately, I placed my napkin on the table, stood from my chair, and looked directly into his eyes. "You're right," I said, my voice steady but loud enough for everyone to hear. "I'm not part of this family's future. But do you want to know why, Richard? Because you've spent your life hiding the truth about who really belongs here." Gasps scattered like sparks. My grandmother's hand tightened around her wine glass. Richard's smugness faltered, just a crack in the mask. But I saw it. He leaned forward, his voice sharp. "Sit down, Isabella. This isn't the time." But I didn't move. My fingers unfolded the letter in slow, deliberate motions, the sound of the paper echoing in the shocked silence. "It is the time," I said firmly. "It's the only time. You've spent over 10 years guarding this secret, twisting it into power, humiliating me to distract from the truth. But tonight, everyone will know what you've kept buried." I laid the letter on the table, sliding it toward the center where the candlelight revealed the faded handwriting. My voice shook with the weight of it, but I pressed on. "This letter is from Grandfather, written in his hand, and it's addressed not to you, not to Mother, not to anyone here, but to James, the son he had outside this family, the brother none of you knew existed, and Richard. Grandfather charged you with protecting him, with making sure he was cared for. You've been hiding it all these years, keeping the money for yourself, while mocking me and pretending you were the strong one holding this family together." The room broke into chaos. Voices overlapped, confused, angry, disbelieving. My cousin Lydia grabbed the letter, scanning it with wide eyes. "It's his handwriting," she whispered, trembling. My mother covered her mouth, her face pale as death. My Uncle Harold slammed his fist on the table. "Is this true?" he barked at Richard, his face flushed with rage. Richard stood abruptly, the chair scraping against the hardwood, his composure unraveling. "Lies!" he roared. "She forged it. She's always been jealous, always wanted to destroy us." His eyes burned into me, wild with desperation. But there was no taking it back now. The words were out, the truth exposed. I looked directly at my grandmother, whose face had gone ashen. "He laughed at me tonight, Grandmother. Told me I wasn't part of this family's future. But tell me, What kind of future can we have if it's built on secrets and lies? James's family, forgotten, erased, denied, and Richard has been feeding off that silence for his own power. Tears welled in my grandmother's eyes as her trembling fingers reached for the letter. She read it slowly, her lips moving silently, until finally, she lowered the page with a broken sob. "It's true," she whispered. "God forgive us. It's true." The silence that followed was absolute. No one moved. No one breathed. The fire crackled in the hearth, the only sound in the suffocating stillness. Richard's face was a mask of fury and panic, his control slipping from his grasp. "You don't understand," he hissed, his voice almost breaking. "If this got out, everything grandfather built would be ruined. I was protecting us, protecting the name." But his words rang hollow, desperate excuses in the face of undeniable proof. Lydia stood, slamming the letter back onto the table. "No," she said firmly. "You were protecting yourself." For the first time in my life, Richard looked small. The power, the arrogance, the dominance he wielded so easily, it all crumbled under the weight of the truth. My family's eyes shifted from him to me, not with pity, but with something else. Respect. Recognition. I had done what no one else dared, shattered the silence that had poisoned us for decades. And in that moment, I realized something profound. I wasn't just part of this family's future. I was the one shaping it. The dinner was never finished. Plates grew cold. Glasses sat untouched. My grandmother excused herself in tears, clutching the letter as though it were both a wound and a relic. My mother squeezed my hand under the table, her eyes saying all the words she couldn't. Richard stormed out, slamming the door so hard the ornaments on the Christmas tree trembled. But for once, his retreat wasn't a victory. It was the sound of a man finally stripped of the lies he had wrapped around himself like armor, and as the quiet settled back over the table, I knew nothing would ever be the same again. The morning after Christmas felt surreal. The house, usually alive with chatter and laughter, was quiet, heavy with the weight of what had unfolded. Richard's absence was palpable, a void that reverberated through the halls like an echo of all the control he had once wielded. My mother moved silently, avoiding my gaze, but her hands trembled slightly as she carried plates to the kitchen. My grandmother sat near the window, the letter still clutched to her chest, eyes distant yet soft. I wandered from room to room, taking in the shattered remnants of what had been our perfect family, and for the first time, I felt a strange clarity. The truth was out. The lies could no longer hide. The family gathered hesitantly for breakfast, each face a mixture of confusion, fear, and cautious curiosity. Daniel stayed close to me, offering a grounding presence as I observed reactions. Cousins whispered quietly, stealing glances at me as though waiting for the other shoe to drop. My Aunt Gloria finally spoke, her voice quivering. "Isabella, you did what needed to be done, didn't you?" I nodded slowly, realizing that in breaking the silence, I had shattered a chain that had bound us all for years. The air felt lighter now, even if tinged with uncertainty. Each word of acknowledgement from the family was a small step toward rebuilding what Richard had nearly destroyed. Richard returned later that day, his arrival abrupt and violent, the front door slamming behind him. He looked wild, a storm contained in a human frame, and the subtle arrogance that had defined him now trembled under the weight of exposure. "This isn't over," he shouted, eyes darting from face to face, desperate for allies, for validation, for anything that could restore his crumbling empire. But he was met with cold stares and guarded silence. His threats no longer carried the same authority. The letter had shifted power. My heart thudded, equal parts fear and triumph, as I met his gaze unflinchingly. Tonight, Richard had to confront the consequences of a decade of lies. He tried manipulation first, speaking quickly, weaving stories of loyalty, duty, and deception, blaming my mother, my grandmother, anyone but himself. "If you reveal this, you destroy everything," he growled, but the family no longer flinched. Eleanor's voice, strong despite her frailty, cut through the tension. "No, Richard. You destroyed it years ago with your lies. The truth only liberates us." I felt the room shift, as though a spell had been broken. The years of fear, of silent complicity, of obeying his whims were cracking. His charm was useless now. The truth was undeniable, heavier than his carefully constructed illusions. For hours, we argued, defended, and questioned. Each revelation revealed more layers of deceit, hidden accounts, suppressed inheritances, and the secrecy surrounding James. I could see the strain on Richard's face, the first true crack in his armor. And yet, amid the tension, there were small glimmers of reconciliation, of understanding. My cousins began asking questions not just of Richard, but of each other, of the family's past. My mother, initially silent, started to speak, offering her perspective, her fear, and her regret. It was painful, messy, but it was real, and for the first time, honesty guided our conversation instead of fear. That evening, Daniel and I ventured to the old study, where the remnants of Richard's hidden documents lay scattered. We carefully gathered everything, cataloging each piece of evidence, not for revenge, but for accountability. "We can't let this happen again," Daniel said softly, exhaustion and determination mingling in his voice. I nodded, feeling the gravity of our responsibility. This wasn't just about exposing Richard. It was about preserving integrity, about ensuring the next generation inherited truth rather than lies. I folded the letter, tucking it safely into my journal, a reminder that some secrets, once revealed, could transform lives. Days passed, and Richard withdrew from the family, isolated in the shadow of his own actions. He tried to negotiate, to charm, to twist perception, but the hold he had once possessed was gone. The family had tasted freedom, and it was intoxicating. We began repairing relationships fractured by fear and lies, slowly knitting the fabric of trust that had been torn apart. Each conversation, each apology, each acknowledgement was a small miracle. I watched my family with a new perspective, seeing both their flaws and their capacity for resilience. In this light, even Richard's betrayal became part of a larger story, a cautionary tale, a lesson in courage. By the time New Year arrived, a tentative peace settled over the house. Eleanor, frail yet strong, smiled at me knowingly, a quiet acknowledgement of the role I had played. "You did well, Isabella," she said softly. "You chose truth over silence. That is bravery." My mother, now unburdened by the lies she had once protected, hugged me tightly, whispering words I had waited years to hear. "I'm proud of you." And as I looked around, I realized that this family, fractured though it had been, was beginning anew, not perfect, but real, grounded in honesty and courage rather than fear. I finally understood something vital. The family I thought I wasn't part of had needed me all along, not to uphold lies, not to bow to Richard's will, but to stand, to speak, to demand justice when no one else dared. That realization settled into me like warmth after a long winter. I had become the catalyst for change, the spark that ignited the truth, and in doing so, I discovered my own strength. Richard's tyranny was over, and the future, though uncertain, was mine to shape. I smiled, feeling a surge of hope that had been absent for far too long. As the evening drew to a close, I looked around at the family, laughter returning cautiously, conversations tentative but genuine. I felt a quiet pride in knowing that I had broken the chain of secrecy, that the shadows no longer ruled our home. The past, with all its pain, was acknowledged, and the present, with all its fragile beauty, was ours to cherish. And as I closed my eyes that night, I whispered a silent promise to myself. No more silence, no more fear, only truth, courage, and the unyielding bond of family. In the ashes of deceit, we had found renewal. I never imagined that truth could feel so heavy and yet so freeing at the same time. The house is quiet now, not the brittle, tense quiet of fear, but a softer, reflective quiet, the kind that settles around you when the storm has passed and leaves a lingering sense of possibility in the air. I wander the halls slowly, touching familiar surfaces, the polished banister, the old photographs that line the walls, the grandfather clock that has ticked in the background of my life for decades. Each item feels different now. Each shadow and memory seems to whisper a story I hadn't heard before, a story that I am finally able to understand. It's strange, the way the past can cling to you, even after it has been confronted. I remember the first time I saw Richard's laugh dominate a room, how it made me small, invisible, incapable of speaking, incapable of resisting. I remember the nights I lay awake, wondering if the family I loved could ever see me as more than the quiet, observant girl who dared to ask questions no one else would. And now, walking through this quiet house, I feel the weight of everything lifted just slightly, tempered by the knowledge that while truth can heal, it also leaves scars. Each scar is a reminder of what was endured, what was hidden, and what was finally revealed. Grandmother Eleanor sits by the window most mornings, her hands folded over the letter that started it all. I watch her sometimes from the doorway, hesitant to intrude, yet I cannot help but feel a profound connection to her strength. She endured decades of secrecy, and yet somehow she survived with her dignity intact. I wonder what it must have felt like to hold such knowledge, knowing that revealing it could destroy everything, or protect everything if wielded at the right moment. The wisdom she carries is palpable, the kind of quiet strength that molds a family in unseen ways. And now, as I watch her, I see the reflection of the person I am becoming, a balance of courage, compassion, and unwavering resolve. I find myself thinking about Richard often, not with hatred, though once, yes, there was an avalanche of anger, but with a measured understanding of what drives people to hide their truths, to manipulate, to control. He was broken in ways I didn't fully understand at first, and yet his brokenness hurt everyone else in the house. The irony is not lost on me. The man who believed himself untouchable was undone by the very truths he had sought to bury. And in the wake of his departure, our family has had to learn to rebuild on shaky but honest foundations. I have learned something essential. Power wielded through fear is temporary, but the power of truth endures. Daniel remains my closest ally, a constant in the aftermath of revelation. Together we have pored over the letters, the documents, and the hidden accounts, not to punish, but to understand, to make sure the mistakes of the past are not repeated. It has been exhausting, and yet exhilarating. Each discovery, each piece of evidence that we organize and place in its proper context, feels like a small victory for the family, for justice, and for integrity. And through it all, Daniel has become more than a cousin or friend. He has become a partner in a mission larger than either of us anticipated. We are both changed, irrevocably, by what we have uncovered, and yet strengthened by it. The house is slowly filling with laughter again, softer now, gentler. Cousins who once avoided me now seek me out, asking questions, sharing memories, confiding in me. My mother smiles with a new kind of warmth, unburdened by the weight of secrecy. Even Gloria, who had doubted me, has begun to show signs of trust and respect. The transformation is not instantaneous. Family, after all, is never simple, but it is genuine. And in the quiet moments, when I sit alone in my room with the letter tucked safely in my drawer, I feel an immense gratitude. Gratitude not only for what has been revealed, but for the courage that allowed the revelation to happen. I often reflect on that night, Christmas, when the truth finally erupted into the room, shattering illusions and forcing every one of us to confront reality. I remember the shock on Richard's face, the silence that followed, and the way my grandmother's eyes glistened with unshed tears. That night changed everything, not just for me, but for the family as a whole. It was a night of reckoning, yes, but also of clarity. In exposing secrets, I did more than just reveal a hidden brother or hidden wealth. I revealed the necessity of courage, the importance of integrity, and the power each of us has to shape the future, no matter the obstacles. Even now, months later, I feel the weight of responsibility settling on my shoulders, a constant reminder that truth must be guarded, honored, and wielded carefully. But alongside that responsibility is a feeling I have never known before: empowerment. I am no longer the silent observer, no longer the one overshadowed by arrogance and fear. I am Isabella, and I have proven to myself, and to everyone else, that I can confront lies, endure threats, and stand firm even when everything feels precarious. That realization carries with it a serenity that is almost intoxicating, a quiet joy that I will carry for the rest of my life. As I close this chapter of reflection, I realize that the journey is far from over. There will always be challenges, disagreements, and moments of doubt. But now, armed with clarity and courage, I know I am ready to face them, to guide my family forward, and to honor the truth that has been entrusted to me. And if you've listened to my story, if you've followed the journey from the shadows of secrecy to the light of revelation, I want you to remember something. Courage isn't always loud, and strength isn't always visible. Sometimes it is quiet, steady, and enduring, like the heartbeat of a family learning to love again. If you've been moved by this story, if it resonated with the truth of human struggle and the triumph of courage, I invite you to join me in this journey. Subscribe to the channel, like the video, and share this story with those who may need to hear it. There are more truths to uncover, more tales to tell, and together we can explore them, learn from them, and find hope in the most unexpected places. Your presence matters, your voice matters, and your willingness to confront life's hidden truths can create ripples far beyond what you can imagine. Thank you for being here with me.